Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. We start tonight in Nunavut, where the 2nd Canadian Ranger Group has been activated by the military. The reservists live in the 14 Inuit communities that make up Nunavut in northern Quebec. That province has been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 virus. Tuktoyaktuk, a hamlet of 1,800 people, updated its situation today, and officials are currently dealing with 12 confirmed cases of COVID-19. 5 people have recovered. There is also a case in Salawit where a person is recovered. The Canadian Rangers are also on their way to eastern Quebec to help Inuit communities along the North Shore, where there are a total of 9 cases in 2 communities. Also in Quebec, Kanawake Mohawk territory, south of Montreal, is dealing with 12 cases. In Ontario, Fort Hope First Nation has the first confirmed case in northern Ontario. On the prairies, there are 6 cases in 5 communities and still 2 cases in 2 communities in the Northwest Territories. In northern Saskatchewan, the 4th Canadian Rangers have been activated. In British Columbia, Blueberry River First Nation has a confirmed case, as does Alert Bay. Across Canada, currently there are 31,644 positive cases across the country. More than half the cases are in Quebec, with 16,798 positive cases. Ontario is next with 9,525 cases. In all, 1,309 people have died from the novel coronavirus. A total of 7,289 people have recovered from having COVID-19, but not all provinces report. Those numbers are as of 5 p.m. Eastern. And some good news out of southern Ontario. Of the 9 cases of COVID-19 reported in 6 nations of the Grand River, 7 are now listed as recovered. Community members say they are remaining strong and unified in their response to the pandemic.
Together, we will get through this.
We really, again, just need to maintain exactly what we've been doing, which is, again, our restriction of access, our constant messaging and communication, of social distancing, staying home, only leaving and going out if necessary. All of the things that we've been doing over these past weeks, I think we just need to be maintaining at this point in time and not really jump too early.
And today's COVID-19 updates from Ottawa shifted from the virus itself to some environmental and economic opportunities during the pandemic. Jamie Pashagumskum has more.
Hello, everyone.
Today, Justin Trudeau announced a new $1.7 billion program to clean up abandoned and orphaned oil wells in some western provinces, saying the plan could benefit Indigenous communities.
In Alberta alone, these investments will maintain 5,200 jobs. We've listened to the concerns of landowners, municipalities, and Indigenous communities who want to make sure that the polluter pay principle is strengthened and that their voices are heard.
The COVID-19 Cabinet Committee stressed the importance of maintaining jobs in the petroleum industry, which employs more than 500,000 Canadians, including around 11,000 Indigenous workers. APTN was hoping to question Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller on this, but he was again absent from the meeting. MPs from opposition parties are also asking questions. NDP MPs Nikki Ashton and Leah Gazan wrote a letter to Miller, raising concerns over funding for urban Indigenous populations. Ashton questioned why the fund had a deadline attached to it when all other emergency funds do not. She said the money just isn't enough.
As my colleague Leah Gazan pointed out, Indigenous peoples are 3% of Canada's population. But when you look at the COVID-19 funding, it's only 1% is going towards Indigenous communities. And we know that Indigenous communities are disproportionately at risk when it comes to COVID-19.
Ashton said she has been contacted by Indigenous leaders concerned for their members living off reserve. And she wants to see more money for them and the deadline for the Urban Indigenous Fund lifted. Jamie Pashagumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Every community in Nunavut is a flying community, so air travel and shipping are the definition of a critical service. That's why the government of Nunavut has continued to pay the airlines millions a week for seats they can't use. Our Kent Driscoll explains.
The government of Nunavut is paying Northern Airlines $2.25 million a week to keep flying. Nunavut's premier explains there wasn't much of a choice.
Airlines are essential service within Nunavut. We would not be able to function as a territory without the airlines going into the communities.
What the government is doing is continuing to pay the airlines what they normally would for seats when travel was at a normal rate. That's around $2.25 million a week. They're paying for now empty seats they would ordinarily use for government and medical travel.
When the airlines were coming to us and inquiring on how we could assist them, their next option was to further reduce their schedule. So in communications, obviously, with Dr. Patterson, we looked at the proposed schedule, and it was just unworkable from a health delivery standpoint. We still have essential service workers moving around. We still need to get samples down to the labs.
The emergency funding was approved by the Territorial Financial Management Board through a special warrant and will have to be accounted for when the Assembly resumes sitting. They're spending money that was already allocated for tickets on planes. They're just not flying with those tickets. They've spent $9 million so far on the airlines, and that total number is much higher when you consider all of the government's COVID-19 related spending.
What we're spending is one thing, but there's also loss of revenue that we have to take into consideration as well, too, and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated to provide hard numbers, but at our early estimates, we're looking at $20 to $24 million right now.
So the planes keep flying with cargo and supplies, but few passengers, and the government keeps paying. At some point, the cash-strapped government of Nunavut will have to account for this spending. But for now, the planes keep flying. Ken Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
The Manitoba government has now banned all non-essential travel into the northern part of the province. The move comes after the conservative government changed legislation to allow new restrictions under public health orders. The ban begins today and runs until May 1st. It includes communities above the 53rd parallel. Centers such as The Paw, Thompson, and Churchill are all affected, as are several remote flying communities. The ban does not apply to people who already live in the north. But if you're delivering goods and services, or your job is related to health or enforcing child welfare agreements, you are okay to travel. Anyone caught traveling for non-essential reasons may be fined up to $486.
We wanted to ensure the orders were in place. We want to ensure that the message is out, that even though we have some numbers here that are making us cautiously optimistic, certainly our battle's not done, and we have to protect those most at risk, and certainly the remote isolated communities are among those. So we have that order in place now. How it's going to be enforced is still, we're still working on it.
Yesterday we told you about a wildfire near Squamish, BC that caused one Indigenous community to be evacuated. Today that fire continues to burn as officials struggle to get the fire under control. Several buildings and one home have burnt down since the fire started Wednesday afternoon. An evacuation alert remains in place for the Squamish Nation Cheekai Reserve, and so does the state of emergency for the Squamish area. Investigators believe the fire was human-caused. We have to take a short break now, but first here's a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the east coast, +4 in St. John's and +5 in Charlottetown. +1 in Happy Valley Goose Bay and 0 degrees in Cartwright. +8 in Quebec City and +6 in Val-d'Or. +8 degrees in North Bay and +9 in Peterborough. +7 in Timmins and +8 in Thunder Bay. -14 in Churchill and +4 in God's Lake. +5 in Winnipeg and +6 in Barons River. +4 in Regina and +2 in North Battleford. -4 in... Welcome back. With over 8,000 confirmed cases, the city of Montreal is a COVID-19 hotspot. While many steps have been taken to mitigate the spread of the virus, advocates say one group in particular has been forgotten. Lindsay Richardson reports.
8 a.m. to 8 p.m. A precarious 12-hour window for Montreal's homeless, shut out of emergency shelters by morning, left to wander until nightfall, just waiting for the city to extend a hand.
We worry every day that people are going to start dying on the street.
Frontline workers like Jessica Chiano say they're at a loss. After they serve hot lunch out of a makeshift tent city, there's nowhere to go. Native friendship centers closed. Most 24-hour hubs also closed. What's open won't accept cash, and social distancing is near impossible to enforce. In cities like Toronto, hotels are used for temporary housing. San Francisco is considering the same. Montreal's hotels are only used for quarantining. And while the city is promoting hygiene, introducing hand-washing stations, for example, advocates say proper accommodations are needed.
So I don't know what the holdup is, honestly.
That's not the only issue. Communicating with the city, they say, is difficult. The threat of contagion still lingers, and there are fears that human rights are overlooked.
The ticketing and kind of the constant presence and the attitude of the police too is not helping in terms of the prevention of the transmission of COVID, which is all of our preoccupation right now.
The SPVM was granted exceptional powers to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak, including ticketing people who don't social distance. This weekend, they handed out 2 $1,500 fines to homeless youth loitering inside a metro station. In a separate incident, an intervention worker was ticketed and charged with obstruction for just doing his job. Quebec's human rights watchdog called the decision not only discriminatory, but ineffective.
We have been repeating this to Santé Publique, to the city, to the SPVM.
One woman, she says, was sanctioned twice.
$3,000, 2 tickets, and she's laughing. She was literally like, I'm going to wipe my bum with this because it doesn't make any sense.
Montreal is still recovering from a particularly fatal year. In 2019, roughly a dozen clients of a prominent shelter died when the shelter was forced to close its doors. A crisis for anyone close to the situation.
I just feel like it's very cruel. Like, I think we live in a country, we've seen so many bailout packages, so much money to all different communities and so forth. I just think it's very, very cruel to allow people to fend for themselves in the middle of a pandemic, and it's also going to affect all of us.
Now, with the virus running rampant, frontline workers say ignoring these gaps will again sound the death knell for the city's homeless. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
With or without COVID-19, the reality of coastline erosion along the Arctic Ocean remains. Our reporter, Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, has a follow-up story we aired 2 years ago from Tuktoyaktuk, where homes were going on the brink of going underwater.
It wasn't a matter of if, but when, that kept Sarah Adam awake at night.
That's behind the house, behind here. See?
Her family's home was victim to coastal erosion on the shores of Tuktoyaktuk. APTN News visited in 2018. They were dealing with waves crashing against the house.
You can't predict it. You just have to learn to keep watching it. Get in the middle of the night, and if you hear the water getting closer, then what can you do? Just be ready.
This month, after years of waiting, the Adams family home was moved 5 kilometers inland near an area known as Reindeer Point.
Just shed a few tears because I'm leaving the ocean side. But I'm happy in a way, so I don't have to be washed away in the summer.
Hamlet Council says 3 households have been moved so far, but it's just the beginning.
Eventually Tuk will be further inland, of course, due to the shoreline erosion and the climate change and all that stuff. So again, we have to be putting these buildings in places where they won't be in any harm. Within the hamlet boundary, we are running out of space for loss.
The point, just down the road from where the Adams house once stood, is rapidly receding. Where I'm standing now will not exist in just a few years. Now the small community of Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories, which is feeling climate change at an alarming rate, is up against time to save their beloved peninsula and, more importantly, their home. The move cost nearly $800,000 and was funded through federal and territorial initiatives. Tuk Mayor Edwin Elias says the hamlet is focusing on other highly vulnerable areas.
The inside of the harbor is eroding as well too. I don't know how long that's going to last, but again, the land is cracking and falling into the harbor even. So, and we don't have much wave action in the harbor. Once the permafrost gets exposed, it doesn't stop unless you deal with it, and to deal with anything like that, depending on the landscape, I guess, all about money and funding.
Elias says discussions are in the works for how to safely bring up adaptation engineers into Tuk this summer to continue preserving the coast against climate change. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
A non-profit group in Alberta that teaches and preserves Métis culture had to stop holding courses because of the COVID-19 virus. But as Chris Stewart tells us, now they are still managing to teach that traditional culture online.
Michif Cultural Connections in St. Albert started up in 2004. The group protects and promotes Alberta's Métis culture by offering instruction in jigging, finger weaving, and more. They also offer Michif lessons, the Métis language which was nearly extinct. Joshua Morin is the teacher.
Yeah, so we did start Michif classes in person a few years back, and we are really proud of just the fact that we are able to establish Michif classes. It's a language that many of us as Métis people spoke, but of course with the history of colonialism and residential schools, especially in the community we're teaching it in St. Albert, they had 2 residential schools. The language was lost.
With the COVID-19 keeping people in their homes, Joshua decided to offer the Michif classes online on their Facebook page.
I didn't want to stop that momentum of giving people access to the language, and because now I'm doing it online, I can serve a broader community, not just the St. Albert community or the Edmonton region, but we get people that are from BC, we get people that are even from the northern United States areas like Montana, and of course even people all the way from Manitoba. So it's a really great opportunity for me to just give people access to the language in a time where, a lot of us are struggling.
He says a loyal group of 15 to 17 students so far are enjoying learning the Métis language.
I've been hearing nothing but good things about it, and people have been really appreciative on the language that I've been sharing, and once it's done, I get messages really quickly of people saying, well, when's the next one? Is there another one happening this week? So people are really still wanting more of it, which is a really, really good to see, I think.
La neige, which is snow. La neige. La neige.
The classes can be found on the Michif Cultural Connections Facebook page, live Fridays at 10 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Mountain Time. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
It's time for one more break, but still to come, newest Amnesty International Canada Media Award winner Trina Roach joins us from Halifax for a preview of Part 2 of APTN Investigates, a relocation experiment. And moving out to the west and north now, +3 in Fort Chipewyan and +5 in Peace River. +6 in Medicine Hat and +4 in Calgary. +18 degrees in Campbell River and +10 degrees in Quesnel. +13 in Fort Nelson and +10 in Prince George. +7 in Dawson and +11 in Whitehorse. +7 in Wrigley and +12 in Fort Simpson. +2 in Inuvik and 0 degrees in Colville Lake. -14 in Chesterfield and -15 in Baker Lake. -13 in Iqaluit and -9 in Clyde River. APTN Investigates video journalist Trina Roach is being recognized for her documentary, Law of the Land. Roach is one of 14 journalists awarded at this year's Amnesty International Canada Media Awards. Law of the Land is the top pick for the long-form video category. The documentary examines the spark of Indigenous blockades both in the past and present. The awards were set to take place May 6th, but has been rescheduled to a later date due to the pandemic. In the 1940s, Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia were relocated under a policy called Centralization. A relocation experiment Part 2 airs tonight on APTN Investigates. In this episode, Trina Roach looks at what happened to a claim for compensation. She joins us now from Halifax. So, Trina, first off, congratulations on your Amnesty International Canada Media Award. Let's just jump right into it. What happened during centralization?
Centralization was a relocation policy which, just like it sounds, was meant to centralize the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia to just 2 reserves, because at the time in the 1940s, they lived all over the province. Indian Affairs wanted to move them all to Shubenacadie or Sibaganagadi and Eskasoni. And they promised housing and jobs, and all those promises sort of fell through. And Mi'kmaq really placed that as the start of a social and economic breakdown. It had really devastating impacts. Loss of livelihood, loss of connection to land, and broke kinship ties. And talking to Chief Leroy Denny, who's the chief of Eskasoni today, he's very proud of his community. There's lots of good things happening there, but he still, his community struggles with poverty and overcrowded housing and health problems and a suicide crisis at times. And so he traces a lot of that way back to centralization. So it's history, but it's history that still matters today. And so he's actually today now looking to start a conversation about getting an apology for the Mi'kmaq and maybe compensation. No idea what that would look like at this point, but it's something that he wants to pursue.
How did you find out about the claim for compensation in the 1970s?
Yeah, it's funny because when I you do a lot of research for these documentaries. There's like archival records and academic research, and one of the things that I initially went to do was look at the Micmac News, which was a newspaper that was run from, I think, like the late 1960s through to the 90s, and just to see if they had ever done any stories on centralization. And I know about centralization, most Mi'kmaq people do, but I was not aware of this. And so I'm going through in 1974. I'm scrolling through all the archived newspaper articles, and there's this article, and it says, the Union of Nova Scotia has this headline: "Who owns Nova Scotia?" And they're sort of laying out a case for Aboriginal title and land claims. And right at the bottom, in very strong language, is a claim for damages for the cultural genocide of the policy of the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia throughout the policy of centralization. And so you had this really strong language, and I just hadn't heard that before. And so it was really interesting to find. And then to hear now that you have a chief like Leroy Denny who's sort of picking that back up again. It'll be really interesting to see where this goes in the future, and you never know, I might end up doing a follow-up to centralization, because I think this is going to be part of the conversation now, today.
Perfect. Thanks, Trina. That's our Trina Roche from Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Thank you.
You can watch the rest of Trina Roche's documentary, A Relocation Experiment, Part 2, tonight after APTN National News. Well, that's your APTN National News for this Friday. Stay up to date with the very latest on COVID-19 by visiting our special page, aptnnews.ca/COVID-19, and by downloading the APTN News app. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thanks for tuning in. Have a safe and healthy weekend.